about Ohio frontier life, the long struggle, 1750 to 1814. And while researching this topic, it became clear that two different cultures were contesting the Ohio country. And these two cultures could not coexist, resulting in, as I've titled it, the long struggle. As background, I think it's helpful to know the groups and numbers of people represented in 1750 as you start out. And this was really news to me. White British in North America, we were all British then, yeah? 1 billion people, mostly considered on the East Coast. Whites in New France, about 50,000. Native Americans east of the Mississippi, look at that number. Can you imagine 250,000 people spread out from coast to coast east of the Mississippi? Wow, it'd be hard to find an Indian, but if you did, that might have been a bad thing. Slaves equal almost to the number of Native Americans. And by 1783, Revolutionary War period, whites 3 million, mostly east of the mountains, east of the Appalachians. But Native Americans were mostly west of the Appalachians. And look, that number is fairly similar again for slaves and Native Americans. Free blacks at that time, 59,000. By 1890, whites were coast to coast at 66 million. And Native Americans, 250,000. So look, their number went down. Now they're on reservations. And of course, blacks were not counted in that as slaves because they were free blacks at that point. Okay, go ahead. Okay, this is really an interesting map to me. It shows all the tribes throughout Ohio and what kind of areas they claimed around this time frame. And if we look down in the Miami Valley here, we can see the Shawnee and the Miami Indians. In the Miami Valley, there were dominant tribes, were the Miami and Shawnee. Many marked trails on the maps were begun by animals searching for food, water, and salt. People also began to use these trails, which were later widened for wagon use too. And often these trails were on the high ridges, avoiding the wetlands, and they became known as the highways. Around 1750, Native American Ohio life was much more advanced than one might think. The Indians had an extensive agricultural system, growing almost any vegetable you could name, and even a tribal government. If there was tribal fighting, it was often over hunting grounds. And most Indians lived in fairly permanent villages while using temporary shelters for hunting camps only. Probably the biggest difference between settlers and Indians was over the ownership of land, and we all know that. The Indians believed that no land could be owned, but was given by the Great Spirit for all the tribe to use. And do you think this could be an area for conflict? These are some of the Indian shelters here in common use throughout Ohio in the 1700s. In the upper left, we see a teepee used as a temporary hunting camp. The upper right picture shows a semi-permanent 1 or 2 family, and this was often called a wigwam. In the lower left is a log house commonly found in Ohio. And James Smith, a captive of the Ohio Indians from 1755 for 4 years through 59, shared a log house like this with 8 men and 13 women and children. He was quoted as saying, actually, the lodging was better than he expected. And the lower right picture shows a log house that could be 30 to 100 feet long by maybe 25 feet wide, a multi-family dwelling, and all shelters like this would have smoke openings for wood heat. Village cabins like the lower two would be located near a spring or a stream, near cleared farming land. Remember we talked about them raising agriculture products, and near firewood. Okay. So what was Ohio country's bounding? What made Ohio so attractive? Well, as you can see, it was mostly wilderness, except for occasional Indian villages. And French and British traders, they didn't care. They didn't make much village or any kind of settlements. They were just interested in trading with the Indians. So they weren't really bothering them. The Indians considered them helping them. And game was really plentiful. Look at this list in Ohio. Can you believe it? This is Ohio. Elk, deer, bear, wild turkey, fish, bison, beaver, muskrat, raccoon. Today we see the occasional possum, don't we? Usually as a roadkill. So, dense forests, lush meadows, land so fertile it was waiting to be tickled by a hoe. And that's a phrase I picked up as well, like from some of my research. So, obviously it was good farming land. People knew about it. Go ahead. Okay, so in the 1700s, the Ohio wilderness had a high canopy of old-growth trees. Some of them were like huge trees. And except for the occasional shafts of light, little understory brush could grow in this forest, and Indians often could walk here or ride a horse. Ohio also had many wetlands and prairies. And today, except for some state parks, it's certainly difficult to imagine, you know, what this beautiful wilderness might have looked like. Okay. How did the traders influence Indian life? Well, as we can see, Dutch, French, and English bartered for goods, and what was the money source? Beaver and deer. Okay. And what did the Indians receive? Well, some of the very things that I have up there on the table as well. Tomahawks, knives, axes, fish hooks, blankets, but most important, some of the things that caused the major trouble: guns, powder, and alcohol. Indians became so dependent on trade that their own culture kind of began to deteriorate pretty quickly. Okay? So what was Ohio's danger? Well, in the 1700s, a very dangerous place for white settlers. And so what were those dangers? Well, we had, let's see.
You want to go back a frame?
Are you back a frame?
There we go.
Let's go. Yeah, the Indian concept of shared lands versus British, we already talked about that. Native Americans willing to fiercely defend their lands, hunting grounds, and way of life. Yep. New white settlers competing for game and control of lands, and they wanted it to be free of marauding Indians. And as we know, the confrontation often ended in violence. Okay, now let's try that next one. Aha. So competing for control, what groups were doing that? Well, Native Americans, having lived here for many years, wanted to continue their way of life free of European competition and domination. They feared the same fate of being moved or killed by settlers as their East Coast brothers had been. The French needed safe areas to move trade between Quebec and the New Orleans area. Plus, they wanted a piece of the New World that they could claim. And the British, and remember, colonial Americans were also British then, they wanted eventually to control and expand the colonies all the way to that place called the Mississippi River. Okay? So the French and Indian War then began, 1754 to 1763, or commonly in Europe it was called the 7 Years' War. It would set the stage for all future conflict to follow. Maybe you remember this war was between the French and their Indian allies against the British, so it's kind of inappropriately named for us to understand it. And here we see in this picture the young 21-year-old George Washington leading the British regulars, and alongside a group of non-uniformed colonial militia soldiers too, and they're over on the right here. British regulars over here. The painting is from Fort Necessity National Park in Pennsylvania. Any of you been there? Cool place, yeah. The battle was the only one that young Washington would lose. And the question remains, how did he become commander at 21? Don't know the answer to that. As you can see, many of the Ohio Indians remain neutral, and here's a quote from the Ohio-Delaware Indians. It's plain that you white people are the cause of this war. Why do you not view the British and the French fight in the old country and on the sea? Why do you come to fight on our land? Came the French and Indian War. So what was the result? The English defeated the French, removing all their claims on the frontier. And in order to quell much of the bitterness and violence between Indians who sided with the French and colonials, King George III, now to get this, issued the Proclamation of 1763. Anybody remember that? No, I didn't. Good for you. Yeah. This temporary proclamation ordered all land west of the Appalachian Mountains to be cleared of settlers and land speculators. Essentially, all land between the mountains and the Mississippi was Indian land. The British government was tired of spending money to keep the peace or to fight the Indians either way. Both sides, however, had vastly different views of the war's results. Anybody see the National Geographic about 6-8 months ago? How wealthy each president was? Oh, what do you think the most wealthy president of the United States was? George Washington.
Really?
Because of all the land claims that he made, centered on this proclamation of 1763. He sent, there's a letter that I found researching, he sent scouts out to claim some of the best land and look it over. Well, at least not so much claim it, but at least look it over, so when this proclamation would be lifted, George would be there owning that land to sell. Okay. So, stories circulated back east of plentiful game and rich lands covered the river cane, America's bamboo, just south of the Ohio River. And the urge to trap, trade, and explore lured a few brave men to travel the Ohio River in search of those lands. The Indians also used these prize hunting grounds for other items too. Arrow shafts and baskets were common uses for the cane. And in my research, I saw two different names for that land below the Ohio. Kentucky, and just that Kentucky might have been an Indian word. So the cane might have come from the cane as well. Okay. Soon brave men were coming with their families, their livestock, and then building cabins in Kentucky. The Ohio Indians' prized hunting ground was being invaded. Okay. And one of those men was none other than the legendary Simon Kenton. This photograph of Simon was taken in his early 80s. And the statue is located in Urbana, Ohio, the location of his last homestead. And Simon helped many new settlers in the ways of the frontier and often aided in returning stolen horses or captives from the Ohio Indians. We only have one photograph that I could ever find of Simon Kenton in his 80s. Why? That's when photography came in. So we have no young photos of this gentleman. Okay. Simon was known and hated by almost all Indians for thwarting the removal of white settlers from Indian lands. And one day Simon was captured by the Shawnee. He was forced to ride a horse through the brush, hands tied while branches smacked in his face. He survived. He was then paraded to many Indian towns in Ohio and forced to run a gauntlet line 9 times. He survived that too. And after that he was to be burned at the stake. It is possible his old friend Simon Girty, a British defector and an American, saved him from the stake by arguing that Kenton was too valuable to British intelligence to be killed. And thus Simon Kenton was known to the Indians as the man who could not be killed. This is Simon Kenton's flintlock rifle on display at the Greene County Museum in Xenia, Ohio. I asked him the obvious question, how do you know it's for sure Simon Kenton's gun? And they said, well, relatives donated it to us and we have evidence that they were the relatives. So there you have it. Okay. So what was Simon Kenton's legacy? And we talked about he assisted folks, white people. He risked his life defending settlers. One thing that was outstanding that I read about him, he could shoot and reload in just a matter of 30 seconds or so while Indians were chasing him. Outstanding military wilderness scout. He worked for some of those folks in the late 1700s against the Indians. He was a fierce fighter when attacked or defending property, and he made many, many land claims signed with that famous X, which did not stand up so well, and he hardly made any money off of any of them. Okay. Here's Simon Kenton's epitaph. In memory of Simon Kenton, his fellow citizens of the West will long remember him as the skilled pioneer of early times, the brave soldier, and the honest man. How about that? And they can say that about each one of us, right? The honest man or woman. Lord Dunmore's War. Do you remember this from your school history? There's another one I forgot about. Lord Dunmore was the British royal governor of the colony of Virginia. And anyone visited Colonial Williamsburg, I assume? Yeah? Sure? Okay, he was the last of the royal governors to live in that beautiful governor's mansion that was replicated there. This war was between the Iroquois, they were in the northern New York kind of area, and Pennsylvania area, and the Virginia colonial militia led by Lord Dunmore. Why? Again, it was over Western colonial expansion and violent encounters between peoples. You can see the results on the slide. The Ohio Indians, Delaware, Mingo, and Shawnee did not honor the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, ending the war even though the Iroquois had signed for them. Can you believe that? One tribe decided they were going to sign for all the rest of them. It is significant that Virginia felt that they gained land east and south of the Ohio River. East and south. So that would be Pennsylvania area and Kentucky area. With this treaty, but not so much for the Ohio Indians. Okay. This painting depicts the battle with about 1,000 warriors and 1,000 soldiers fighting in. It must have been horrific. The Battle of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And with the British to the north and now the Americans to the south, that placed the Indians in the middle of Ohio and right here where we are today in the conflict. The Indians wanted their prime hunting ground back in Kentucky, and they made frequent raids there. Americans countered with raids to the north, and many Indians favored the British, who gave them guns and supplies as another way to drive out the Americans. Simon Gerty, that friend of Simon Kenton, was a trusted colonial Indian language translator, who defected then to the British. He likely was tired of American Indian policies and unfair treatment. And while he helped many white captives to escape or cope, he was known by most Americans as a traitor. And random killings throughout Ohio and this area were still the norm. Okay. So the wars, back up one there, Sharon. Thank you. I was going back or forward. There we go. The wars resulted in 1783 and it obviously ended in a stalemate in Ohio. Both could destroy but not hold territory. Kentucky was defended. The Shawnee lost their prime hunting ground. You think that would have made them mad? You bet. The British signed away Ohio to the Americans, and no Indians were consulted. However, no American soldier was north of the Ohio River, for obvious reasons there. Okay, now. Jumping past the Revolutionary War, we pictured here is the restored 1790 home of Mr. James Galloway, on display at the Greene County Museum in Xenia, Ohio. So what was Ohio life like around 1790, and what's significant about this house? Anyone been over there? You should go, it's very cool. Yeah, all right. Ohio was still a dangerous place in 1790. Stealing and raiding of horses, supplies, and burning homes was not uncommon. Pictured here is a painting of James Galloway, while below is a photograph of his daughter Rebecca Galloway in her later years. And again, there's that, we don't have any young pictures of her, do we? Because of the photographic thing. It seems that the young rising star of the Shawnee Indians fell in love with young Rebecca. And this young star asked Rebecca to marry him. But after much consideration, each wished for the other to live in their own world. And they finally parted friends, but never married. That young Shawnee's name was? Tecumseh. You bet. Thereafter, James Galloway's home, interestingly enough, was never threatened by Indians. And also pictured are several period furnishings of the home. Okay. Government campaigns directed by President Washington against the Ohio Indians were begun. At this time, Generals Hamar and St. Clair and their armies suffered defeats to a coalition of Indian tribes. Next, President Washington selects Mad Anthony Wayne, whose army defeats the Indians at what became known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers. This site was once ravaged by a tornado and was near Toledo, Ohio. General Wayne takes advantage of the Indian custom of fasting the day before a battle, so he waits a full 3 days before to attack. Some Indians had gone for more food, while others were left in a weakened condition, and Wayne easily claims victory. Wayne then invites the Indians to talk peace at a place called Greenville, Ohio, and their treaty rewards are listed on the slide. Okay. As you can see, the treaty line ran from Lake Erie upstream on the Cuyahoga River, which is down on the map, and west across to Greenville. White settlers were to stay below the treaty line, and Indians gave up their prized hunting grounds once again in the Miami Valley and the rich land surrounding the Great and Little Miami Rivers. Indians were now restricted to northwestern Ohio, so they lost Kentucky, and now they've lost this, and they're moving up here. Okay. Go ahead, Sharon. At Greenville, over 100 Indians attended, representing 12 different tribes, and having grown tired of war, the Indians reluctantly accepted Wayne's terms. And for a few years, there was peace for settlers below the treaty line. In this painting, Chief Little Turtle is seen representing the Miami tribe, along with General Wayne on the right. Okay. After the treaty, many settlers came north of the Ohio River. Most towns in southern Ohio were settled after that 1795 treaty. Examples were Dayton and Centerville, both settled in 1796. And most towns north of the treaty line were settled after 1814, and that would be the conclusion of the War of 1812. Interesting. That's when the Indians were starting to be shipped out from that area as a result of that war. At the time, it was also customary to give land grants to Revolutionary War officers and soldiers. Land companies with surveyors designated the land to be resold to settlers. Do you think there was money to be made? Jonathan Dayton, a signer of the Constitution, attached his name to the new town by the great Miami River, calling it Dayton. And we should have Jonathan's picture there. There he is. You've all seen that if you worked at Carillon Park, I'm sure. Go ahead to the next one. So in 1796, no, Indians never lived on the Dayton site. It was considered too wet and prone to flooding. Interesting, isn't it? 3 groups left Cincinnati for Dayton. I'm repeating that this is what you all know already. 1 boat up to Miami, 2 overland with 1 by wagon, the other walking with livestock. 19 men, 17 women, and children. A total of 36 people settled Dayton in the wet, prone to flooding. Yeah. Okay. Dayton's first family. This drawing shows the Samuel Thompson party arriving by boat up the Miami River on April 1st, 1796, after the Treaty of Greenville. And George Newcomb, without a doubt, Dayton's most famous of the founding fathers. He's photographed here, again in his 80s. Why? Because of that photography thing. He was a veteran of Anthony Wayne's Indian campaign, ran Dayton's first tavern, first sheriff, first jailer, first bank president, served in the War of 1812, was elected to the Ohio Senate. He was also a tax collector, clerk of courts, and a judge. Obviously a man for all seasons, and now we're going to find out he was a brewery operator as well. Outback, anything to make money, yeah? A good man. Newcomb Tavern. This beautiful drawing shows Newcomb Tavern in 1799. I love this. It should be on a postcard somewhere. Maybe it is. 1796, George Newcomb. Again, I'm repeating what you already know, but this talk is for others as well. Had Robert Edgar build a family log house, which is the right half of the structure. 2 years later, Mr. Edgar completed the left or tavern half. In addition to the construction, Mr. Edgar was to provide the family with a fresh deer once a week. And notes show that this was not difficult, since deer would come in the early morning to drink from the Great Miami River. The tavern provided such amenities as a place to park your horse out back, floor space upstairs for your bedroll, and one of Mrs. Newcomb's hard-cooked meals if you were on time, for all the sum of 65 cents, or about a day's wages. Now, Newcomb Tavern today, Dayton's oldest surviving structure, can be seen at Carillon Historical Park. When you walk through the building, imagine the tavern functioning as a busy tavern, hotel, and restaurant. Newcomb Tavern even served as the community as Dayton's first jail, a church, general store, and Montgomery County's first courthouse. In 1803, after much political debate, Ohio became the first state admitted to the Union from this large area around the Great Lakes called the Northwest Territory that bordered the southern part mostly, Great Lakes. The House and Senate gave their approval, and who gave the approval as president then? Anybody know? Guy that wrote the Constitution? Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, yeah. Thomas Jefferson signed the Enabling Act of 1802, calling for the remittance of Ohio to the United States. And that was in 1803, obviously. Okay. Around 1808, the brightest and most eloquent speaker of the Shawnee Indians, Tecumseh, along with his brother known as the Prophet, predict the destruction of the white man at the hands of the Indians. And Tecumseh travels great distances to convince many tribes to join him in the united battle against white settlers in the United States. He traveled to the south, he traveled to the west, to the east. He was always on the go, convincing Indians to join him. Tecumseh's dream, Prophetstown, named after Tecumseh's brother, was established in Indiana. And many tribes joined them there, waiting for a sign to battle. Essentially, the Indians were opposed to the sale of any Indian lands. In 1811, after a loss at the Battle of Tippecanoe, many Indians returned home, seriously weakening Tecumseh's ultimate goal of Confederacy and his dream. William Henry Harrison's army had repulsed the Indians and burned Prophetstown. Once again, for Ohio, the British were aiding Indian uprisings. And once again, the Indians side with the British, hoping to drive the Americans out of their native land. And Tecumseh is then ultimately killed in Canada in the Battle of the Thames. And with his death, the dream of Indian autonomy dies too. And then in 1914, with the Treaty of Ghent, the war ends. All conquered lands are returned to their pre-war boundaries. And quickly, the new nation expands, and Indians are gradually moved west of the Mississippi. Okay. Epilogue, the Miami Indians. In the late 20th century, Senator Lugar of Indiana introduced a bill to recognize the Eastern Miami Indians. He later withdrew support due to constituent concerns over gambling, which many tribes have used to aid economic development, health, and education for their own benefit. In 1993, a federal judge ruled that the Eastern Miami were recognized by the United States in the previous 1854 treaty. And that the federal government had no right to strip them of their status in 1897. However, the judge ruled that the statute of limitations on appealing their status had expired, and the Miami had no right to sue. The Shawnee Indians. The former Kansas Shawnee, remember they were moved out of Ohio, became known as the Loyal Shawnee, and some say this is because they sided with the Union during the Civil War, or because they were the last to leave their Ohio homelands. And this group was regarded by the United States as part of the Cherokee Nation known as the Cherokee Shawnee. In 2000, the Loyal or Cherokee Shawnee finally received federal independent recognition. They are now known as the Shawnee tribe, with most members residing in Oklahoma. Occasionally, as I was told as I visited the Greene County Museum, tribal members have come to the Greene County Museum in Xenia, Ohio to see the James Galloway home that Tecumseh visited and the chair he sat in while courting the young and beautiful Rebecca Galloway. Okay, next picture. Well, if you are aware of what happened up at Lake Erie just this past weekend, there was a reenactment of the Battle of 1812 in Lake Erie. That happened actually in 1813, the battle did. We happened to be on site that day as part of the crew to be involved with that. This is a replica ship. I just put in a few pictures here of that day. Of Perry's final flagship. You remember he got the first one shot out from under him. That was called the Lawrence. This is called the Niagara, and it is one beautiful ship, as you can see. I have pictures of walking to or through that. There were quite a few people that day, so it's not going to be as close up as you might expect, but what a gorgeous boat. Okay, which line do I pull? Oh my.
How did they even know?
A lot of lines. A lot of lines. It would take a day or two to learn all that stuff. This is the bowsprit on it, looking forward with a little modern day buoy there, or bumper, excuse me, bumper ball. Okay, and this is a nice picture here. I couldn't get a real close-up of the cannon. It was so crowded around there. When they're on a ship like that, cannon are called? Guns. When they're on land, they're called? Cannons, right. New to me. I learned something that day. And you can see the way the folks bumped back in those days with a modern polyester sleeping bag. And that's a beautiful picture of the boat as well, the Niagara. And to prove that we were there, yes, there's the Niagara and there's our ship. And you can see the two Native Americans riding in there piloting the vessel that day. So, that's it, folks. Thanks for listening.